Ready? Let's dive into today's story. Buckley's Chance. William Buckley's extraordinary Australian Odyssey. In the dawn of the 19th century, as Europe's empires carved up the globe, a most improbable survivor etched his name into history. William Buckley, a towering giant, born in 1780 in Macclesfield, Cheshire, stood an incredible 6'6" tall in an era when most men barely reached 5'5". This former soldier, with hands like shovels and shoulders broad as an ox, found himself aboard the creaking transport ship Calcutta in 1803, bound for the edge of the known world. His crime? Receiving stolen goods after falling in with bad company in his regiment, the 4th or King's Own Regiment of Foot. Once a respected soldier who had fought in Holland under the Duke of York and suffered a wound to his right hand in battle, Buckley's steady conduct had earned him promotions. But after returning from a 6-week furlough visiting family in Cheshire, his association with men of questionable character led to his downfall. Tried at Sussex on the 2nd of August 1802, his sentence was 14 years in Britain's newest hellscape, Australia. As Buckley himself would later recall, "I do not know to this hour the precise character or extent of my sentence, reflecting the arbitrary military justice of the time when soldiers and sailors were dealt with more at the pleasure of the chief military and naval authorities than by judges or justices." Being a trained bricklayer who had been apprenticed at age 15 to a Mr. Robert Wyatt, Buckley was selected for the expedition to found a new penal colony at Port Phillip Bay. Lieutenant Colonel Collins of the Royal Marines was appointed governor, with the Calcutta carrying officers and a detachment of Marines to guard the prisoners. During the long voyage, Buckley made himself useful working with the ship's crew. As he later recalled, "The treatment I received on the passage was very good. I was permitted to be the greater part of my time on deck, assisting the crew in working the ship." When the Calcutta dropped anchor within the Heads, about 2 miles from what would later be called Point Lonsdale, Buckley and his fellow convicts stepped into a land that Europeans barely understood. The hastily established Sullivan Bay settlement was doomed from the start, cursed with barren soil, scarce fresh water, and crushing isolation from other colonial outposts. Most men would have accepted their fate. Buckley had other plans. On the 27th of December 1803, as the settlement's meager Christmas celebrations faded, Buckley and several other desperate men slipped away into the vast Australian bush. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable escape in colonial history. While his companions either returned to certain punishment or disappeared into unmarked graves, Buckley pressed on alone. For weeks he survived on shellfish and roots, his military training keeping him alive as his body wasted away. Death seemed inevitable. Then came the moment that would define the next 3 decades of his life. Stumbling upon a freshly prepared Aboriginal gravesite, Buckley noticed a spear placed ceremonially with the deceased. Desperate for any tool of survival, he took it, unwittingly triggering what anthropologists now consider one of history's most fortuitous cultural misunderstandings. When members of the Wathaurong people, which Buckley would later spell as Wathaurong in his memoir, discovered this gaunt, pale giant wielding the dead warrior's spear, they didn't see an escaped convict. They saw Murangurk, their deceased kinsman, returned from the spirit world, reborn in this strange white body. According to their beliefs, the dead could return in new forms, and Buckley's otherworldly appearance and possession of the burial spear confirmed their spiritual understanding. Rather than drive away this intruder, they welcomed him home. Buckley's transformation from British convict to Wathaurong tribesman wasn't immediate. Initially unable to communicate beyond gestures, he learned their complex language through total immersion. The Wathaurong taught him to hunt kangaroo with spear and boomerang, to locate hidden water sources, and to navigate by stars unfamiliar to European eyes. Within years, Buckley was fully integrated, participating in corroborees, ceremonial gatherings, speaking fluently, and eventually taking a wife according to tribal custom. His height and strength made him variable in hunting and tribal conflicts, while his knowledge of European ways remained a curiosity to his adopted people. For 32 years, longer than many convicts lived after transportation, Buckley existed between worlds. He witnessed seasonal migration, births, deaths, and tribal conflicts. He carried tribal scarification marks on his body and grew his hair in the traditional way. The British convict had died. Murangurk lived. As Buckley would later reflect, during these decades he inhabited dwellings of a very different description, having for their roofs only the widespread of heaven. Gunn was a bricklayer who once built houses for other people to live in. Now he moved with the seasons, following ancient pathways across what would one day be called Victoria. Occasionally, European ships appeared on the horizon, but Buckley stayed hidden. The sentence for escaped convicts was death, and he had no reason to trust that colonial justice would recognize his extraordinary circumstances. History finally caught up with him in 1835, when John Batman's expedition from Tasmania arrived to establish what would become Melbourne. After watching the settlers from afar, Buckley made the momentous decision to approach them, appearing like a specter from another time, his massive frame wrapped in kangaroo skins, his beard reaching his chest, speaking broken, nearly forgotten English. The settlers were dumbfounded. Here was a European man, long presumed dead, who had survived for decades among people the colonists considered savages. His knowledge of Aboriginal languages and customs was unparalleled, making him an invaluable interpreter. Recognizing Buckley's unique position, Lieutenant Governor George Arthur granted him a full pardon. For a brief period, Buckley served as a cultural bridge, trying desperate to help both sides understand each other as the colonial machine pressed forward. But Buckley soon found himself a stranger in both worlds. The Aboriginal peoples he had lived among were being displaced by the very settlers he now assisted. Meanwhile, European society viewed him with suspicion too, native in his mannerisms and sympathies to be fully trusted. Disillusioned, Buckley eventually moved to Hobart, Tasmania, working as a gatekeeper at the women's prison. The man who had once roamed freely across Victoria's wilderness now lived within strict colonial boundaries, his connection with his original family completely severed. As he noted in his memoir, "With this sentence, whatever it was, ceased my connection with my family, and I have never since heard of either or any of them, except for a rumor that his brother might still be living in Middlewich, Cheshire." On the 30th of January 1856, after surviving 3 decades in the bush, countless tribal conflicts, and the perils of colonial Australia, William Buckley met an unexpectedly mundane end, thrown from a horse-drawn carriage at age 76. His legacy survives in Australian vernacular. Buckley's chance describes a hopeless prospect, an ironic nod to the man who defied impossible odds. More profoundly, his life represents one of history's most remarkable cultural crossings, a man who didn't merely observe 2 colliding worlds, but lived fully in both. In an era when European explorers died by the dozens attempting to survive the Australian interior for even short periods, Buckley thrived for 3 decades, not by imposing European methods, but by surrendering to indigenous knowledge that had sustained the continent's first peoples for over 60,000 years. William Buckley, convict, survivor, adopted tribesman, cultural intermediary, a giant in more ways than one, whose extraordinary life story remains one of history's most improbable survival tales. Thanks for tuning in. Bye for now.